I'm going to try to attempt a video lecture today. I've only ever recorded one of these before with the video kind of at the corner of the PowerPoint, so hopefully it won't take up too much space. My main concern, honestly, is that it's probably going to take a lot more time to upload and process. So if that does happen, I might have to switch back to the audio only. But I wanted to at least give you a little bit of both, at least one video lecture, one audio lecture, so that you could help me decide whether or not, or which one that you'd prefer, basically. So today we are going to start with Chapter 2 on reading and evaluating scientific research. So this chapter is basically going to introduce you to all the different research methods that we use in psychological research and talk a little bit about what makes good research. So what differentiates, kind of pseudoscientific research or not so great research from really valid and reliable empirical research evidence. So in Module 1, we are going to talk about how psychologists do research. So words such as math, research, statistics, and methods tend to make students nervous. They wonder why we need to learn about these topics. However, if we did not have proper research methods and ways to interpret our findings, we may adopt mistaken beliefs and come to inappropriate conclusions. So we already talked a bit about pseudoscience in the first chapter. That's one of the major reasons why we really have to be careful about the type of research that we're doing and the type of research evidence that we're accepting. For example, you may have heard claims such as these before. A lot of people like to think that there's been statistically significant evidence of ESP, or extrasensory perception. Some people say that facilitated communication can help children with autism type full sentences and answer questions. So facilitated communication is kind of a type of kind of aided communication process in which someone works with the student to kind of try to interpret for them. And you've probably all heard the claim that listening to classical music will make your baby more intelligent. Unfortunately, if we look at the research evidence, none of these things have really proven to be consistently true. So by the end of the chapter, we will know how to think critically about such claims. So our Module 2.1 is Principles of Scientific Research. So again, as I mentioned before, the very first thing we need to talk about before we delve into the actual research methods is to have a bit of a discussion about what makes good research versus what makes not so great or poor research. So what makes psychological research scientific? For research to be scientific, the main keyword here is that it must strive for objectivity. And basically what that means is that we can observe and test facts independently from the person describing them. So the opposite of being objective would be being subjective, which means that it's influenced by your own biases and assumptions and things like that. But if we're talking about good scientific research, we want it to be objective, so as free from biases and assumptions and personal opinions as possible. So some of the key criteria for quality scientific research, and we'll talk about each one of these in a bit more detail in the following slides, include it is based on measurements that are objective, like we just discussed, valid, meaning they measure what they set out to measure, and reliable, which means that they'll measure in the same way across different times. So you're not, getting one score on a test on a certain day, and then you take the test 3 weeks later and you get something entirely different. The second key criteria is that it can be generalized. So it's no good for us to look at one person, one case, and try to basically then take their results and apply it to everyone else. We know that humans are unique, so we need to try to find scientific principles that can kind of be generalized to the greater public. The third is that it uses techniques that reduce bias. And we will talk in quite a bit more detail about different types of bias and how we can help reduce them. And later on in our chapter on cognition, we'll actually talk a lot more about different types of cognitive biases that we might have. The fourth is that it is made public, so we do need to be able to disseminate or share the results of that research, which mostly takes place through scientific journal articles. And the fifth is that it can be replicated. So even the most interesting scientific finding, if you replicate that experiment 10 times and you can't find those same findings, it's pretty much useless. So we do need to be able to have some level of replicability. And we'll talk again about each of these in a bit more detail in the next few slides. So with respect to objectivity, scientific methodology must use objective measurement. So basically the measure of an entity or behavior, so whatever it is you're measuring, the variable, within an allowed margin of error is consistent across instruments and observers. So again, it's not taking into account personal bias or assumptions or opinions or emotions. You're kind of free from all of those constraints. And if you remember when we talked about critical thinking in the last chapter, you'll notice that a lot of these key criteria for good scientific research really correspond quite well with those kind of key criteria for critical thinking. So the object, concept, or event that we are measuring is known as a variable. Variables must each be given an operational definition, and this is a word that's going to come up time and time again. Essentially what it means is that you're defining that variable in a way that is precise enough to specify how you are going to measure it within the context of your research. So it's important to note that the same variable can have different operational definitions depending on who's conducting the research. For example, if you want to measure if something is related to anxiety, how are we going to define anxiety? Are we going to define it as racing heart? Are we going, physiological measures? Are we going to define it as score on a questionnaire to assess anxiety? There are a lot of different ways that we can define that construct. So the operational definition is how we are going to define that construct with respect to the research that we are doing. So I'm going to operationally define anxiety as the score on a questionnaire measuring anxiety. So you can see in figure 2.1 here that we do have a couple different examples of an operational definition. So for example, if you were hoping to measure a variable of intoxication, you could look at your physiological measures, which are your blood alcohol level. You could look at behavioral measures, such as if people can't walk straight or they're kind of staggering all over the place. Or you could look at a self-report measure. You could ask somebody, how much have you drank? How intoxicated or impaired do you feel? So even though the variable stays the same, we need specific operational definitions to define how we are going to measure it within the context of our research. Next, we have reliability and validity, which again, all kind of combine into that first point about our research needing to be objective, reliable, and valid. So in order for research to be considered scientific, the tools that a researcher uses to measure their variables of interest must be both valid and reliable. So validity, as I kind of previously mentioned, is the degree to which an instrument or procedure actually measures what it sets out to measure. So if you say that I am going to determine whether anxiety is linked to, a certain behavioral trait or a certain type of food eaten, then you need to make sure the method that you're using, the operational definition that you have for anxiety, is actually going to measure a level of anxiety. There's another type of validity. There are several types, but another one that's kind of pointed out in your textbook is ecological validity, which basically means that the results of a laboratory study can be applied to or repeated in a natural environment. So just because you can find a certain result within a laboratory setting doesn't necessarily guarantee that you'd be able to find that same result in the real world, because obviously a laboratory setting is pretty artificial. So ecological validity is a really important construct as well. With reliability, we're talking about the degree to which a measure produces the same results from one place, time, or score to another. So we want consistent and stable answers across multiple observations and points in time. So again, I kind of brought this one up earlier. One of the types we talk about is test-retest reliability. And so obviously, if you are testing somebody on their measure of mathematical ability, and you give them a test on Monday, and then you give them the same test 3 weeks later, you're going to hope that they'd have very similar results. Another example that comes to mind for this one is certain personality tests. So for example, the Myers-Briggs personality test, which is a really popular test that everyone loves to do and find their personality type. Obviously, personality shouldn't change across time, just based on how personality is defined. But if you do look at the results for the Myers-Briggs test from, say, 1 month to another, most people tend to have the results change over time, which obviously shouldn't really happen. So in that case, we would call that test pretty unreliable. You can also do something similar to that called alternate forms reliability, where instead of giving the exact same test, because of course the danger with giving the exact same test is that they might do better the second time just because they're more familiar with it. So instead you can give them a slightly alternate form that's still supposed to measure the same construct. And again, then you can compare the scores on the two tests. And if they're fairly similar, you would think that that test is relatively reliable. And finally, another type of inter-rater reliability we talk about another type of reliability we talk about frequently is inter-rater reliability. My favorite example of this is assessing personality traits in dogs. So basically, inter-rater reliability means that if you take a bunch of different researchers and they are all trying to measure the same construct, that they all have similar ratings. So there's a piece of research done, and I talk about this a bit in the cognition chapter and the personality chapter, but basically they decided to all try and assess a bunch of dogs. So they watched videos of these dogs interacting, playing with other dogs, and they wanted to assess whether these dogs were exhibiting characteristics of the big 5 personality traits, which again is something we'll get into much later. And they did in fact find very high inter-rater reliability on 4 out of the 5 major dimensions of personality. So basically what that means is that every different rater, every different person who was rating those dogs, they all tended to agree on the ratings pretty strongly, which is actually pretty good evidence that dogs do have somewhat of what we would consider a personality, which I think is pretty cool as well. So here's just a little diagram that kind of shows you the difference between the test-retest, and the alternate forms reliability. So the test-retest, again, is looking, are the scores similar from one session to another? So in the case of that Myers-Briggs personality test, they're not overly likely to be a lot of the time, which means it would have low test-retest reliability. And then the alternate forms reliability is basically giving a slightly different version of the test, but still intended to measure that same construct. So hopefully, again, your scores would be very similar on both forms of the test. The next major criteria we want to talk about for quality scientific research is generalizability of results. And again, I kind of very briefly defined this before, but generalizability basically means the degree to which one set of results can be applied to other situations, individuals, or events. So we don't want to find this really fascinating phenomenon in one person, but then if you look at the rest of the general public, you don't really see those same results. We want, when we find a really exciting, interesting finding, we want it to kind of generalize across different individuals and situations and populations and things like that. So because psychologists are primarily interested in understanding behaviors in general and predicting how most people will respond, we are looking for a fairly high degree of generalizability in our results. Ideally, in a perfect world, we would study an entire population. We would take all of the people from the group that we want to study, and we would assess every single one of them. Obviously, that is not possible. I'd say not even 2% of the time, unless it's a very small population. Maybe it's people with a rare disorder, something like that. But if I want to study a particular phenomenon in Canadian university students, it's pretty much impossible that I'm going to be able to reach out and assess every single one of those students. So what we do instead is we study a sample. We pick a sample from the population, we study those people, and we hope that those results will then be generalizable to the overall population. How a sample is selected is really important to generalizability. So we try to use a random sample. Again, in a perfect world, we would take that entire population, say of Canadian university students, and we would randomly pick, a certain amount from all the different universities across Canada. So we would kind of basically put them all in a list and just draw names out of a hat. Again, not something that's super easy to do and easy to access. So in that kind of sample, basically you'd have every member of the population having an equivalent chance of being included. But unfortunately, we often have to settle for convenience samples instead. So a convenience sample is basically a sample of individuals who are the most readily available. And honestly, the majority of psychological research, you may guess this, but it's done with undergraduate psychology students. Because as I mentioned in our first class, we can actually give you a bit of course credit, an extra bonus percentage towards your grade for participating in our research. So it's really easy. You're a great captive audience, and it's really easy for us to kind of get a lot of intro psych students, undergraduate psych students participating in research. The unfortunate thing about that is if you think about, all the people, the characteristics of the people who study undergraduate psych courses, they are probably more similar to each other in one way or another than they are to the population at large. So we do still have some issues with generalizability there. So we really want to make sure we can generalize both from the individual or the small sample to the overall population, and also that we can generalize from who we're studying kind of across different settings as well. So again, if we do a laboratory study, we're going to want those results to generalize to the greater public in the real world, which kind of again brings in that question of ecological validity. So now we're going to talk about some sources of bias. As we mentioned in that list, one of the major things that we need to do when conducting good scientific research is try to examine and account for our sources of bias and eliminate them if at all possible. So even if we're using reliable, valid, and objective measures, so we're using tests that have been proven reliable and valid, we're trying not to take our opinions, assumptions, things like that into account, there unfortunately are various types of bias that can still unintentionally be introduced, both by the researchers and the participants. So sometimes just the act of observation can trigger a behavioral change. This is something known as the Hawthorne effect. It's basically named after a Chicago area factory called Hawthorne Works, and basically what they did is some researchers went in and they were trying to determine ways to increase worker productivity in the workplace, and they found that no matter what they did, everything that they introduced, directly afterwards the workers started being a little bit more productive. So that was really strange. They could, maybe put more light in the room and the workers began to become a bit more productive. Then they might turn the lights down and the workers still seem to increase their productivity. They might give them, shorter breaks, but more of them, or then they might give them longer breaks, but less of them, fewer of them. So basically what happened is they found that no matter what it was they manipulated, it seemed like the workers increased their productivity each time. And so after a while they thought maybe it's not necessarily the intervention that they're introducing, but it's the fact that as soon as those interventions were introduced, the workers are being observed really closely. So maybe it was the fact that they were being watched closely by their superiors and by the researchers that increased their productivity rather than the interventions that were being made. Participants may also tend towards social desirability. This one is pretty straightforward. I mean, obviously we all want to be socially accepted. Nobody wants to be an outcast. So unfortunately, sometimes that crosses over into our research, and participants will respond in ways that may increase their chances of being viewed favorably by others. So they basically act in a way that they think makes them look good. And this is particularly concerning when we're asking about really tough topics, maybe things like, sexual activity or drug use. Sometimes people will lie because they don't want to look bad to the researcher. Another concern, which is very similar to this, is with demand characteristics. So in an experiment or a study, if there are certain cues that are given off by the researcher or the experimental context that kind of indicate how participants are expected to behave, that might actually influence your results as well. So a very big example, and one you've probably heard of before, of demand characteristics is the placebo effect. So basically, if you give somebody a drug, and you say this drug is supposed to increase your energy level, a lot of the time, just the act of taking that drug and the participant expecting that it is supposed to increase their energy level, it actually does increase their perceived level of energy. So it's very interesting because even though, you can give somebody a pill that literally has no active ingredient, just the very act of giving them that intervention makes them feel like they should be behaving or should be feeling a certain way, and it can actually really dramatically increase, productivity, energy levels, whatever it is that intervention is trying to do. One of the major ones that I always find funny is in a lot of research, if they're researching alcohol use or something related to alcohol use, they will have two different groups. They may have a group that's in a room drinking a rum and Coke, and then the other control group might be in a room drinking a Coke that's flavored with rum extract. And even though those people are not consuming any alcohol, they will actually start to even exhibit physiological symptoms of being drunk. So the placebo effect can be very powerful in that the expectations you have about what's going to happen or what's going to occur can really influence the results. So your text, I'm not going to get very much more into this, but your text does provide an excellent example of working the scientific literacy model with respect to bias in research. It goes into the different characteristics of experimenters that might also affect the research or the expectations that they have. So for example, there were researchers, students who were given rats to run on mazes and work with, and basically some people were told that they were given bright rats that were really intelligent, and others were told they were given dull rats. And it turned out that the ones who were given rats that were described as being bright or being smart actually did perform better. But that probably has a lot to do with the expectations of the experimenter. Obviously, the rats themselves weren't thinking, hey, I'm supposed to be smart. But just the fact that the experimenter thought they were going to do better maybe made them treat the rat in a slightly different way, maybe handled them a little bit differently, and that did seem to influence the results as well. So bias can unfortunately be a really influential thing when we're looking at research evidence and different research that we're conducting, so we really have to be mindful of those sources of bias and how we can help control for them. Speaking of that, here are some techniques that help us reduce bias. So one of the very best techniques to help reduce bias is to provide anonymity and confidentiality to the volunteers. So especially, as I mentioned before, if you're conducting research that's talking about difficult topics, things that people consider taboo or might not want to talk as much about, you really have to be careful to ensure participants know that their data will be kept anonymous. So once that data is collected, you won't be able to kind of tie it back to them. It'll be kind of all put into a pile, and so there's nothing identifying associated with the data. And also that it'll be held confidential, which basically just means it's not going to be given to people that don't need it. So it's the data set is only going to be viewed and used by the people for which it's absolutely necessary. So we're keeping it anonymous, you can't identify the participant, we're keeping it confidential, you're not just dispersing that data all over the place for no reason. So this helps with social desirability because if a person knows that the information they're giving isn't going to be easily kind of tracked back to them, they're probably more likely to be honest in their responses. So in order to help with demand characteristics, we can use what's known as a single blind study. So again, if you give somebody, say if I talked a minute ago about studying something related to alcohol use, if you have a group of people in one room and you're giving them a cup with alcohol in it, you say, here's your rum and Coke, and the other room you give them a cup of coffee, they're going to know whether or not they're in the control group or the experimental group, right? They know whether or not they're receiving the alcohol or not. And again, based on what I just told you about the placebo effect, sometimes the people in that experimental group might exhibit kind of those symptoms of being drunk or what have you, simply because they know that they've consumed alcohol. So a single blind study means that the participants themselves do not know the true purpose of the study, or else they don't know which treatment they are receiving. So in a drug trial or anything where there's kind of an active ingredient being given to a participant, you want to have one group who actually receives the intervention and another group who does not, which we call the control group. We'll get into that a bit later. And you want to ensure that they don't know which group they're in. So therefore, if there is a placebo effect, you'll be able to see that in the group that didn't receive the intervention. Also, in order to help reduce potential researcher bias, like I just mentioned in the case with the maze bright and maze dull rats, we often use a double-blind study. So not only do we not tell participants what group they're in, we also don't tell the researchers what group they're in as well. So this can be achieved by basically having a third party who sorts the participants into one group or the other. But the researcher, the experimenter who's running the data analysis and kind of giving the instructions to participants, if they don't know which group they're in, the participants are in, they can't then kind of unintentionally treat the groups differently based on which group they're in. So that can control for that researcher bias as well. So in single blind, the participants don't know which group they're in or don't know what the purpose of the study is, so they can't try to act a certain way. And in double blind, neither participant or the experimenter knows which group any individual is in. So now we'll move on to the next criteria on our list of important criteria for scientific research, for good scientific research. So it's really important that we share the results of our research. Once scientists have designed and conducted an objective experiment that is free of bias, it's very important that they communicate their findings. So the primary mode of communication in psychology is through scientific journals. But first, the articles must go through peer review. So I can't just decide I'm going to do some research and, write my study up, send it to a journal, and it just gets published like that. Because obviously, even if I do have the proper credentials, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm using, really great research methods. I might be kind of manipulating my data or doing some kind of funky analysis. So basically what happens is if I submit an article that I want to be published, that article is then taken and sent out to kind of a jury of my peers. So peers being people who are kind of experts in the field of study that I'm studying and doing research in. So for example, as a clinical psychologist, if I wanted to do a study with a particular type of therapy I was experimenting with, then once I have the results of that research and I write it up for publication, I would send it to the journal, and the journal would then send it out to, maybe 5 or 6 other clinical psychologists. And they are able to read and critique my work to make sure what I'm doing is quality research and that the results and conclusions that I'm reporting make sense. And in that way, we're kind of held accountable for our research, so we hold each other accountable. This process helps ensure that only the very best research is made public. And then finally, we get to replication. So replication is the last of those major criteria for good scientific research. Once the research has been published, other researchers may want to build upon the knowledge or check the results. So, and this kind of relates back to that last point, when we are sharing our research, when we are disseminating those results and publishing our studies, we need to make sure that we have a method section that details exactly what we did, exactly how we defined our variables, so those operational definitions, and we want it to be specific enough that another researcher could come along, take our paper and say, okay, I'm going to try to reproduce this research. Because as I mentioned at the very beginning, unfortunately, even the most interesting, objective scientific research, it might use great research methods, it might be super interesting and find this never-before-seen result, but that can become obsolete if its results cannot be replicated. Because unfortunately, just like in any other area, there can be flukes. So we do have to be very careful. So basically, we can accomplish either building upon or double checking the results through replication, which formally is defined as the process of repeating a study and finding a similar outcome each time. So if we're not able to find that similar outcome, we would deem that study unreplicable. I'm not sure if that's a word. We're not able to replicate it, and unfortunately those results might not hold as much weight at that point. The publication bias in psychology is extremely strong, unfortunately. Basically what that refers to is that typically the results and the papers that are published tend to be the ones that see a positive result. We don't tend to publish a lot of studies that didn't really find anything, because obviously no one's really interested in reading a ton of studies where there wasn't an interesting result. So that's why replication is so important, because even if you find this really cool result, there could have been 500 other studies out there that did the same thing and didn't find the result, but they weren't published because they weren't very interesting. So just because one researcher found it once doesn't mean that that result is could be generalized or could be found in other situations. So there was something called the Open Science Collaboration, and basically what happened with them is that they took 100 psychological studies, and they found that 36 to 47% of them weren't replicable. They tried to repeat them once and they didn't find the same results. Now, that sounds pretty dire, but we have to keep in mind at that point they're only replicating each one once. There was another project called the Many Labs Project, and they studied 13 different psychological studies, different publications, and they tried to repeat each of the studies 30 times, and they did find that 10 of the 13 were replicable. So, it's still not great. There are still a lot of results out there that might not necessarily be replicable and generalizable, but as long as we're able to kind of keep working at that and keep trying to replicate results, that's how we can guarantee that the science we're putting out there is as valid and as generalizable as possible. Now, we're going to kind of go to the opposite side of this and talk about 5 characteristics of poor research. And you'll see that a lot of these are very similar to basically kind of the opposite of the ones that we just talked about. So the first is that the hypothesis is not falsifiable. And again, I mentioned this last class in the first chapter, but basically what that means is that we haven't stated our prediction in a precise enough way that it can be proven false. If we're stating it in a way that there's no way to find evidence that it is not valid or not true, then that is not a very good hypothesis. The second is that it uses anecdotal evidence. So anecdotal meaning basically an individual story or testimony, trying to use that as evidence. So a lot of weight loss programs, for example, you'll see commercials on TV or on the internet, and all of these people talking about how much weight they lost. Unfortunately, those are anecdotes. Unless you have hard data that says, 70% of people who participate in our program have these results, then that's not really kind of good research. That's basically relying more on a personal story rather than the data. And you will see a lot of the time, if you look in small print on the bottom of those advertisements, it will say results will differ dramatically, and this is not necessarily kind of a what's the word? Common case or typical case. A lot of the results that they show are the more extreme ones. The third is that unfortunately a lot of poor research can suffer from data selection bias. So if you look hard enough, you'll probably find a study published somewhere that says almost anything that you want to say. Because again, there are a lot of studies out there that, might find really interesting results, but it doesn't really mean that their methods are valid and reliable. It also doesn't really mean that they're replicable. And unfortunately, a lot of the time people actually manipulate the data, and they will kind of alter things in a way that show what they want. So data selection bias basically means that a very selective slice of the data is presented. So for a very long time now, we've been kind of debating the topic of climate change and global warming, and as you'll see in one of the examples I'll show you in a minute, there are thousands of articles out there that support the existence of global warming and climate change, and there are maybe 20 that say that it might not be that big of a deal. But if a person is motivated enough, they will find those 20, and they will say, look at all these articles I found that support my point, ignoring the fact that there are thousands out there that kind of contradict their point. The fourth characteristic of poor research is that it involves an appeal to authority. So basically that's the belief that an expert's claim should be taken as fact, even when there's no supporting data or scientific evidence. And this is really interesting because I'm actually taking a research methods for clinical psychology course right now, and in our very first class the other day, we kind of talked about how an expert's opinion or an expert's kind of knowledge is actually one of the lowest factors on the totem pole when we're looking for kind of hard evidence of something existing. So just because someone's considered an expert in their field doesn't necessarily mean that they know everything about that field. And so we shouldn't just take their claims as fact. And then finally, it consists of an appeal to common sense. So a claim that appears to be sound but lacks supporting empirical evidence. And this is kind of very related to what we call pseudoscience or pop psychology in the last chapter. There are a lot of claims out there that seem to make sense just based on kind of general knowledge and what we've always done, which could be, appeal to tradition as well. But if you actually look for it, there's no real scientific evidence that those opinions are actually factual. And so we also have appeals to tradition, so, we do things as the way we've always done them, or novelty. A lot of the time, you'll see the new best thing for weight loss, or the new best thing for anti-aging. And just because it's kind of new and exciting, people kind of take it as fact when in fact it isn't. So one of the kind of funny examples from the textbook of an appeal to common sense, for a very long time people thought the Earth was the center of the universe. They figured it didn't make much sense if we were here and this was, our planet that we were living on. Why would we be circling around something else? They just assumed that Earth was the center of the universe. And I mean, based on common sense, if you didn't know what we know now about science and not astrology, I guess, but astronomy, why wouldn't you believe that the Earth was the center of the universe or the center of the galaxy? But obviously, once you look into it scientifically, you would find that that's not true at all. So here's a great little example of falsifiability of a hypothesis. I always struggle kind of coming up with examples off the top of my head, so I tend to go back to this one. It's actually taken from an older textbook that we used prior to, we have a new edition now of this textbook, and we had an older edition of it, and then before that we had a textbook by Wade. But I really like this example. It's pretty straightforward, so I kept it in here. So the first one in A is an example of a falsifiable hypothesis. So if your hypothesis is that misery loves company, the prediction based upon that would be that when people are anxious, they're more likely to want to be around others in the same situation. So the possible outcomes, if you were to conduct a study, would be that anxious people are more likely to wait with others, anxious people are more likely to want to be alone, or anxiety has no effect on behavior. And if your prediction was that if people are anxious, they're going to want to be with others, then only the first of these possible outcomes would support your hypothesis, and the other two would actually prove you wrong. They would refute the hypothesis. And then you see in B, if you believe that dowsing, which is kind of an older technique that's supposed to help you find water that's buried beneath the surface of the Earth, if they believe that dowsing reveals that subterranean water, the non-falsifiable prediction is that dowsers will reliably find water, unless the planets are misaligned, observers give off bad vibes, etc. So you can see right now, is there any way of proving this hypothesis wrong? No, right? Because they've put in enough kind of extra information here that even if you don't find that the dowsers are able to find the subterranean water, you can still say that it supports your hypothesis. So the possible outcomes would be that they find water, which of course supports the hypothesis, or they don't find water, and then you would say, oh, well, it was probably just one of those other things. So they probably could find water in any other situation. It's just this one case. So in that way, they're stating their prediction in a way that you cannot prove wrong. And again, I'm going to take just a quick example from that course that I'm taking now in research methods. We learned about a man named Henry Cotton, who was kind of a pioneer in a way in psychiatric research, and basically he figured that a lot of mental health issues that we have could be solved by basically cutting off the offending body parts. So if we want to eliminate whatever kind of disorder that we're suffering from, we just need to cut out parts of our brain or arms or legs or whatever to kind of help us deal with that situation. And so if he cut out a body part and it seemed to help, then great. That supported his hypothesis. That was right. He was right. That was what he had to do. But if he cut off a part that didn't help, he'd say, oh, well, I just didn't cut out enough. So again, you could never really prove him wrong because his hypothesis was non-falsifiable. So that kind of, again, shows you why it's so important to have falsifiable predictions in research. And then finally, this is the last slide for this section. It's just an example of data selection bias. So this is one that I kind of brought up before, but if we're talking about global warming, there are unfortunately a lot of groups opposed to the idea that we as humans are playing a part in global warming, and so they'll point to the research that supports their view. But look at this. There are almost 14,000 peer-reviewed, so again, judged by a panel of experts in the field, climate articles between 1991 and 2012. Almost 14,000. There are 24 that reject global warming. But because people tend to look for what they believe in, you be sure that those people who think that humans have nothing to do with global warming will point to those 24 articles and ignore the 14,000 that say otherwise. So again, they're choosing a very small selection of the data. So they're biasing their choice of results based on what they expect to find. So obviously you can see how this would be not great in terms of a research situation. So that is it. This is my newer picture. This is Pixie, my little girl. She likes to help me when I'm working on my notes at home. So it's not the end of chapter 2. I guess I should have changed that, but this is the end of the first module. So I'm going to end it here, and this will be our lecture for Wednesday, September 16th, I want to say. And so this is the first module. We have 3 more modules for this chapter. The third one is honestly only like 7 slides. It'll probably be like maybe a 15-minute video. So I'm hoping to get them all filmed right now. And then as soon as I'm back in the land of high-speed internet next week, I'll have them uploaded for you, and you can watch them either ahead of or during next week's classes. So thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.